All right, so let's get started. This morning, we are talking to 3 women in person and 1 over Zoom. These are women who have been, we're hoping can shed some light on who they've been meeting with and what they've been doing working at Capitol Hill on public policy with leaders and legislators, and working also in some legal capacities. So we are hoping that they can tell us about what the conversations have been like, who they've been meeting with, maybe why some of the other traditional organizations that have defended women are not presently. And with that, I'm going to introduce, we have representatives from WOLF, the Women's Liberation Front, Women's Declaration International, that's Kara on the screen, Independent Women's Forum, and Concerned Women for America. So one really interesting thing about these organizations is that they see a lot, or maybe actually most, political issues in very different light. They take different sides, especially in light of the recent hot topic, abortion. But all of these groups have come together around this issue of recognizing women as a separate sex class from men, finding common ground in advocating for the respect and fair treatment of women. And they have all worked on this sport-specific issue. And as you can see, they've built quite a coalition. It's nice to see some bipartisan and across the political aisle working together. So with that, I'm going to give a short bio for each of our panelists, and then they're going to give you a little elevator pitch about the organizations that they represent. I hope you'll pay attention to the elevator pitches, and if there's a group that you feel like aligns with some of the things you're passionate about, maybe reach out and see how you could get involved or connect people that you know in your communities that might like to be involved. So I'm going to begin with Doreen. Doreen she's a senior advisor for Concerned Women for America. This is the only organization that has taken official actions against the NCAA universities right now, forcing female athletes to compete against males in women's sports in violation of Title IX. Doreen's work at the national level focuses on protecting women, children, and families from the destructive impact of gender ideology. As a writer, commentator, and policy advocate, Doreen has been a leading force raising awareness and seeking protection for female athletes since 2019. In addition to her nonprofit work, Doreen has broad experience in policy, strategy, and communications roles across the federal government within the White House, the U.S. Department of Education, Health and Human Services, and within both chambers of Congress. Doreen holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Kansas and a Master of Public Policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. She and her husband were both former high school athletes, and they raised 2 athletes of their own, a son who played college baseball and a daughter who is now a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army. Doreen, would you tell us a little bit about Concerned Women for America?
Thank you. Yes, Kim, it's delighted. Concerned Women for America is the nation's largest public policy women's organization. We were founded about 43 years ago, at a time when the National Organization for Women was declaring that they were speaking for all women of America. Our founder, Dr. Beverly LaHaye, didn't align with some of the positions that they were advocating, and she just started with around her kitchen table with the little prayer group. And what that happened is to spawn a nationwide network of women who come together through really the heartbeat of our organization, or prayer action chapters across the country and communities all over the country, as well as state directors who work in state legislatures, and then, of course, our headquarters, which is in Washington, D.C. So we work both in education as a 501c3 organization and an advocacy organization as a 501c4. I was their chief lobbyist for several years when I was living in Washington, D.C. I've recently moved west, but I still spend most of my time engaging with congressional offices, educating on these issues, and I've really been delighted to be able to focus more in this gender space since it's become such a big deal. So we are a grassroots in focus, and so one of the things we do are galvanize our ladies and members, and they're men and women. We're not exclusive, but to contract members of Congress, we've set up ways of people to be action-oriented in engaging with the governments, whether that's at the state level or at the federal level. Again, we try to have tools and resources in people's hands. I put some cards there on this Title IX subject that you has a QR code that you can get in directly information about what we're doing in standing for women, female athletes. There are some fact sheets on there and other things that might be useful to you as you're in your communities. So again, it's just been a pleasure to be a part of working together with other organizations here, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Doreen. And next, I'm going to introduce Devin, who's sitting right next to me here. This is Dr. Devin Jane Buckley. She obtained a PhD from Duke University in literature and philosophy, a master's degree from the University of Chicago, and 2 bachelor's degrees, one in neuroscience and one in philosophy from Boston University. She has published and received awards across several disciplines, and Dr. Buckley is currently a board member at the Women's Liberation Front and the author of Woolf's Encyclopedia of Bad Gender Arguments. She's also a writer at 4W Pub, where she has published articles on the metaphysics of gender ideology and the state of feminism in academia. Dr. Buckley is in the process of leaving her academic career and pursuing law school after being recently disinvited from a lecture engagement at Harvard when her involvement with Woolf and her public criticism of gender were discovered. So with that, Devin, you want to tell us a little bit about Woolf, please?
Sure. So we are a national feminist, nonpartisan nonprofit, so we don't identify as Democrat or Republican or anything. As long as you agree with our issue categories, then join Woolf. We are committed to defending women's sex-based rights. We are gender abolitionists, which means that we want to do away with the concept of gender. We would speak about gender roles. We, of course, acknowledge that there are socially constructed roles, gender roles, that have been assigned on the basis of sex historically across cultures, but we don't believe that gender is something that is innate, and we don't believe that it's a kind of invisible substance, a sort of reality existing unto itself, which is how it gets treated sometimes within gender ideology. I'll actually be discussing gender from a philosophical standpoint in a few minutes. But we are very committed to fair play in sports, obviously. We insist on women's rights to safety, privacy, and boundaries, including within prisons. We actually have a lawsuit going against the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitations. California is housing male convicts with women in the women's prison. Their law, SB 132, allows them to do it. All you have to do is say you're a woman, and that's good enough, nothing else. By the way, 100 of the 300 requests for transfer made by men were by sex offenders, and the ACLU wants those to go through, FYI. So we also defend the LGBT community, despite the many accusations of being conservative or right-wing that we've had thrown at us. One of the issues of concern to us is that there are men who identify as women who are calling lesbians bigots because they don't want to have sex with them. So we are, if you're interested in a feminist nonprofit that still defends LGBT rights, we are definitely for you. We also do a lot of legislative advocacy. So in addition to our litigation, most of our work involves giving testimony on bills on a state-by-state basis. And I'll go over some of the examples of that later. And we also produce resources such as my Encyclopedia of Bad Gender Arguments, and also a civic engagement guide, how to get involved more in legal advocacy as a private citizen. We have a reading list, and we have a blog with various news sources. So if you're interested in those things, come up to me later. I'll give you the QR code. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Devin. Okay, we're going to try out the Zoom now. Kara, can you respond and make sure everyone can hear you?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Oh, yep, this worked. Okay, so now I'm going to be introducing Kara Dansky. She is the president of the U.S. chapter for Women's Declaration, International. Kara is a public speaker, writer, and consultant who is committed to protecting the right, privacy, and safety of women and girls on the basis of sex and throughout society. In November 2021, she published the groundbreaking work, The Abolition of Sex: How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls. She currently serves as president of the U.S. chapter of WDI, which seeks to promote the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. She served on the board of the Women's Liberation Front from 2016 to 2020. Kara is also an attorney with a JD from the University of Pennsylvania and a bachelor's from Johns Hopkins University. She has an extensive background in criminal justice law and policy. Between 2012 and 2014, she served as senior counsel on criminal justice policy at the aforementioned ACLU. So, Kara, can you please tell us a little bit about WDI?
Yes, and thank you so much. I'm so sorry I couldn't be with all of you there personally. As Kim knows, I tested positive for COVID on Saturday, so that put a kink in my travel plans, but I'm very happy to be here with you today. WDI is an international organization launched in the United Kingdom in 2019, and its purpose is to promote the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights all over the world at the international level, nationally, and here in the States at the state level. As Kim said, I'm the president of the US chapter. As I said, we work at the national level primarily, but we also have a lot of state legislative advocacy. I'm very grateful to my colleagues at CWA for helping me set up a series of meetings in Harrisburg in Pennsylvania a few weeks ago, where we worked to pass what I think is the 19th state bill to protect women's sports. And I thought what I would do, and we're very happy to support Wolf's litigation against the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. It's absolutely crucial litigation, and we absolutely wish Wolf all the best in that lawsuit. We also filed what's called an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, in a case pending in federal court in Tennessee, where 21 states have sued the Biden administration, alleging various violations of constitutional and statutory law regarding the series of orders and memos that it promulgated during mostly 2021, including, of course, the ones that impact Title IX, but also several orders that impact other areas that threaten to undermine women's sex-based rights in a number of areas all over the country. So I thought I would just read the titles of each article of the Declaration. There are only 9, so they're quite short. When I refer to the Declaration, I mean the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. The Declaration reaffirms women's sex-based rights, including women's rights to physical and reproductive integrity and the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women and girls that result from the replacement of the category of sex with that of gender identity. Article 1 reaffirms that the rights of women are based on the category of sex. Article 2 reaffirms the nature of motherhood as an exclusively female status. Article 3 reaffirms the rights of women and girls to physical and reproductive integrity. And I'll just quickly note, this is one of the areas where my organization parts ways with some of my colleagues on the panel. We do support the right to abortion. Article 4 reaffirms women's rights to freedom of opinion and freedom of expression. Article 5 reaffirms women's right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Article 6 reaffirms women's rights to political participation on the basis of sex. Article 7, most relevant to today's gathering, reaffirms women's rights to the same opportunities as men to participate actively in sports and physical education. Article 8 reaffirms the need for the elimination of violence against women. Article 9 reaffirms the need for the protection of the rights of the child. So anyone who's interested in learning more about the Declaration and about our work can go to www.womensdeclaration.com. Anyone in the world can put your name on the Declaration if you agree with the principles that I just outlined. And if you're in the States and interested in participating in our national chapter, and if you're a woman, you can go to www.womensdeclarationusa.com and submit a volunteer application, and one of our volunteer coordinators will be in touch with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kara. Okay, and finally, we have Jennifer from Independent Women's Forum. So Jennifer, thank you for being here. And Jennifer is the director of Independent Women's Law Center. She's a former member of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. Jennifer is an expert on Title IX, the Education Amendments of 1972, and has taught courses on civil rights and constitutional law at both Boston College Law School and Suffolk University Law School. She writes and speaks widely on issues related to civil rights, civil liberties, and other aspects of constitutional law. Jennifer is a graduate of the Harvard Law School, where she served as an editor of the Law Review. After law school, she clerked for 2 federal judges and practiced labor and employment law with the Boston law firm Ropes and Gray. A longtime political columnist and editor, Jennifer's writing has appeared in a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, The Hill, and National Review Online. With a background in both media and law, Jennifer has a unique talent for breaking down complex legal arguments for a general audience, which we sure hope you put to use today. You want to tell us a little bit about IWF, please?
Sure, yeah. So IWF is, I would say we're on the conservative side of the political spectrum, but unlike the other groups here today, we have never taken a position on abortion. We have people who work for us who are both pro-life and pro-choice. The founders of our organization were on both sides of the issue. We also never took a position on gay marriage or any of those more, I don't want to say hot button social issues, because this has become a hot button social issue, but IW aims to reach an audience that might be moderate, right of center, libertarian, conservative leaning, but not necessarily, as conservative as perhaps the people who would be members of CWA. Although we also have a lot of overlap with people who are members of CWA. But really, from a strategic standpoint, there aren't a lot of issues, I think, where we disagree. There are just issues where we don't take a position and they do. And so from a strategic standpoint, we sort of market our arguments to a different audience, trying to get just a sort of a different political constellation of people to see that conservative arguments aren't scary. So anyway, that's sort of what IWF is all about. We work on a ton of different issues, from economic liberty issues to legal issues, education issues. As Kim mentioned, I am the director of the Independent Women's Law Center, which works on these gender versus sex-related issues and anything really to do with legal or constitutional issues. We got involved in the women's sports issue actually when the Bostock case was before the Supreme Court, and as I think everybody knows, that case actually had nothing to do with sports, but everything to do with whether or not sex and gender are legally considered the same thing. And we filed a brief in that case. I think we were the only brief in that case focused exclusively on women's sports. And what we told the court is, we understand that this case has nothing to do with sports, but if you rule a certain way, if you rule that Title VII, that the definition of sex under Title VII includes gender identity, this is what's going to happen in sports, and it's going to destroy Title IX. And that was the premise of our whole brief. Justice Gorsuch, in his majority opinion, basically rejected that and said, no, this case is only about employment. This case is not about women's sports or anything else. Justice Alito cited us in his dissent and basically said, you're wrong. This is about all these other areas, and your ruling today is going to have an astronomical impact on sports, which, of course, flash forward a few years, and now we see that it has. So what we do is we don't bring direct litigation like ADF does. We don't represent clients. What we can and do is file amicus briefs in court. We also have a storytelling campaign where we produce videos and we produce all sorts of social media posts and graphics to amplify the stories of athletes that are being impacted by this. We help get them in front of lawmakers to tell their stories. So we have that, and the other thing that our organization I think is particularly good at is driving comments to federal agencies and driving petition letters to, for example, the NCAA or USA Swimming. We drive a lot. We get the public to submit their feedback through our website. And so we're very good at activating people in that regard. We don't have a state-based organization where we lobby for state legislation, but we do activate people nationwide to speak out against some of the things that are happening. And we'll be doing that specifically with respect to the new Title IX regulations that the Biden administration just released last week. So that's some of the stuff we do. I guess I'd also say that we provide a lot of educational materials. And actually, one thing I should refer you all to, is we put out a comprehensive report called Competition after the Bostock decision came down and after we saw what was happening. And we actually worked with a lot of legal scholars on this report because we realized that the sports-related cases were going to start percolating up through the courts. And the idea was to have a single resource for law clerks and judges to be able to turn to, because prior to the release of this report, the information was spread across many different fields and many different areas. So for example, you could find the scientific literature, but they're in different scientific journals or books. You could find the stories of athletes who have been impacted. Those are in other places. You could find information on Title IX and the law, but that's in law journals and law books. So we wanted to put it all together as a one-stop resource and basically get it out to the courts and to people who might be working in the courts and make it available to people to see. So we have this report where we compile, Carol's research from her book. We compile Emma Hilton's research. We look at all of this. We have pretty graphics that make it easy for somebody who's not a scientist to understand. We have all the charts that show the male-female athletic gap and the disadvantage that women face when competing against men. And we do the same thing with the law. We break it down and make it really simple and explain what Title IX does, what its purpose was, how these new regulations or court decisions are undermining the purpose of Title IX. And it's all together in this one book, and it has lots of beautiful pictures and graphics of many of you athletes out there. And so we're going to be revising that, actually, because so much has happened since it came out. We're going to be including more athlete stories. We're going to be including changes in the law and updating that, because these cases are percolating. They will eventually make their way up to the Supreme Court, and we want this resource to be out there for anybody who's writing briefs on this or reading other people's briefs and wants to find their citations quickly.
Thank you very much. So can I summarize and add in something here for me? You all you meet with the politicians, both local and federal or nationwide. You write amicus briefs for all the organizations. Just so, because I know what one is, but could you define, one of you please, what an amicus brief actually is for people listening?
Do you want to take that since she's a law
It's a friend of the court brief, so you don't represent, well, you might represent a client, but you don't represent a party to the case. And you're basically just presenting arguments to the court in support of one side or the other, and maybe making arguments that the parties themselves aren't making. So, for example, in the Bostock case,
Before you even go to the Bostock case, I want to tell us first that, and then what you would do to be in. So tell us the amicus brief, but then someone give us some background on the Bostock case.
Right, so the Bostock case was about gender identity in employment. So the lawyers in that case could only argue about employment law. They could only argue the facts of their case and the laws that apply to their factual situation. So other groups like ours could come in and file a brief and say, think about the repercussions this will have on other laws or other areas of policy that the parties themselves couldn't make.
Okay. Did you want to add something? Okay.
Oh, and technically, any of you could write one. I mean, you probably have to have like the legal background to do it well, but there's actually no restriction. Like, you could just write one.
Oh, that's interesting. I did not know that. We could all get really involved. All right. My hope is that Devin is going to kick us off here, giving a little background and providing some enlightenment on terminology. So I've asked her to just give us what is gender from the political landscape, policy landscape. What are we dealing with here, and why is this an important thing for us to understand as women when we're discussing this with or trying to influence lawmakers or policymakers?
So we've heard a lot about what is sex, and I think we're all fairly clear on that now. So I just wanted to go and give a little outline of how I believe this concept is being used. And sort of the summary is that it's not, that there is no clear or consistent definition of gender offered at all. Often when you ask proponents of gender ideology to define it, they produce either circular definitions or incoherent, otherwise nonsensical definitions. So I'm just going to go through some of the different camps, some of the different sects that you see within gender ideology, because you hear different things from different people.
Sex as in S-E-C-T-S.
Yes, sorry, I shouldn't have used that word. I created ambiguity. So some proponents of gender ideology differentiate between sex and gender. And you see this in FINA, right, where they will acknowledge, they'll believe that trans women are women, but they will acknowledge that they're biologically male. And so their gender inclusion policy treats gender as a real thing, but it differentiates it from sex. So they write, for example, classifying athletes on the basis of sex is necessary to meet FINA's goals for female aquatics athletes and the women's competition category, end quote, right? So other proponents of gender ideology, and I think this is becoming the increasingly common position to hold, view sex and gender as synonyms, and that's sort of what we saw Colin Wright attacking yesterday, such that if a man claims to be a woman, then he is also female. This is the position of the ACLU, by the way. They are referring to their defendants in our lawsuit as females. In another case, in the Connecticut runners case, which went to court, the federal judge insisted that the athletes, the males, be referred to as transgender females, right? So this is becoming more common, I think. Importantly, anatomy, physical appearance, and genitalia don't seem to matter at all, at least in this definition. Like the ACLU says that they will acknowledge the existence of like a penis, for example, but they will say this has nothing to do with being male. So effectively, like the first group that differentiates between sex and gender believes in male women, whereas the ACLU just believes in women, right? And all women are female. It's just being female, means you could have a penis, you could have a vagina, you could have whatever. So we have three concepts in play, sort of material reality, sex, and gender. And those three concepts, how they relate and how they're defined, constantly shift in those sorts of ways. To complicate matters further, the term gender...
mind-blowing.
By the way, please read some of the sections of my Encyclopedia of Bad Gender Arguments. It's actually entertaining if it weren't so horrifying. To complicate matters further, the term gender has been used in history to refer to sex, but in an accurate way. So when you look at drop-down lists, right, that say, what is your gender? They're really asking you, what is your sex? So if my grandmother said, like, what is your gender? She would have no idea that any of this ACLU business was going on. She'd think, oh, you're just talking about whether you're female or male, right? So it has been used as a synonym for sex in the past, but not in the way that the ACLU uses it as a synonym for sex, irrespective of genitalia. So there's also another distinction to make, and this actually has to do with second wave feminism. In academic second wave feminism, which is, by the way, very different from and in many ways opposed to the state of academic third wave feminism that's happening today, which produced gender ideology. That's in the legacy of, gender ideology is in the legacy of Judith Butler queer theory style feminism. I won't give you a lecture on that right now. But all you need to know is that the use of the term gender in second wave feminism was completely different. So for example, Kate Millett, she wrote a book called Sexual Politics in 1970, that's when it was published. And she used the term sex to refer to immutable biological reality, right? She used it correctly. She used the term gender, which she did differentiate from the term sex, but she used it strictly to refer to social roles. So effectively, whenever she said gender, she meant like a socially constructed role, right? A gender role. So just whenever you hear the word gender in Millett, it just means gender role.
Can I interrupt
Yes.
you for 1 second? Just
Yes.
because sometimes this was confusing for me when
Oh,
I was
sure.
first having these discussions.
Yes.
When you say a socially constructed gender role,
Yes.
those change from culture to culture.
Yes.
They're different. So, and this was something also confusing for me, is like if you wanted to be a woman in the United States, but you weren't female, you wouldn't necessarily have to be a woman in Afghanistan.
Right, so what she would say is that women are adult human females, which is the position we hold, and that women are assigned feminine gender roles. She wouldn't say that you actually are a woman because you're performing a given feminine gender role.
Okay.
Yeah, so effectively, in second wave feminism, gender is always sort of a part of a hierarchy. So it's viewed as sort of an aid of patriarchy and therefore a bad thing and something that has to be abolished, right? Whereas now it's sort of being enshrined and celebrated. That's a huge key difference, right? So for Millett, gender is the end product of socialization into patriarchy, and it's always constructed. It's not an innate essence. It's not a feeling. And it's also not separable from sex, since the role is always assigned on the basis of sex, right? So in Millett's feminism, a girl who likes skateboarding is just a person with a hobby. We don't need to gender skateboarding, right? And now what you're seeing in this movement is, oh, well, if you're a girl and you like skateboarding, maybe you're a boy. So we see, yeah, a sort of affirmation
Taylor's
of
eyebrows just shot up.
an affirmation of stereotypes, right? But you could think of many second wave feminists as effectively promoting a kind of individualism. So women's liberation means I have the liberty to be an individual, right? That I shouldn't have anyone assume anything about my personality, my hobbies, my talents on the basis of my sex. I should be confronted merely as an individual and assessed on the basis of my capabilities and preferences as an individual. So one final thing, and I'll finally stop talking, is that some gender ideologues actually don't insist that you have to perform sexist stereotypes in order to be a man or a woman. Some of them actually go so far as to say that no semblance to female stereotypes, no semblance to female secondary sex characteristics is necessary to be a woman. All that is necessary to be a woman is to claim that you are, and the only thing that allows us to know that you are is that you said that you are. So it's a form of subjective knowledge that is non-verifiable by an outside objective source, and it's self-attested. So this is the ACLU's position again. So the burliest, hairiest macho man on earth can be a woman without changing anything about his clothes, his hair, his behavior. All he needs to do is say, I am one, and that's now California state law. So basically the gist of it is that when people say feminism, that can mean a variety of different things, right? So our organization identifies as feminist, but we're on the opposite page of most contemporary academic so-called feminists, right? So whether or not gender ideologues believe that a man is a woman because he looks like a woman or because he says he is, it's important to emphasize that both positions, both camps, are denying that women are adult human females, and we don't want them to change that definition, right? We want to continue to insist that. So that's the one thing they do have in common, even though they are inconsistent on all those other philosophical bases. And in many cases, they always want gender to supersede sex.
Can I say a few things about terminology? First of all, about feminism. It's so funny because even within our organization, I have a colleague, Inez Stepman, who calls herself an anti-feminist. Well, Inez and I agree on almost everything, and I call myself a born-again feminist. So there are different strands of feminism, and it's hard to get your mind around sometimes. But about the sex and gender thing, I just want to say, especially to the young people out there, just stop using the word gender. I know that it's become in our society synonymous with sex. As Devin was saying, you see it in the drop-down menus all the time, right? You go to buy an airline ticket, and that's what they use. But it's really not the same thing. And by using the term gender, when you really mean sex, like if you say gender discrimination, so-and-so brought a gender discrimination lawsuit, well, you really mean a sex discrimination lawsuit. When you use the term gender, you are giving the gender ideologues a hole to drive a truck through in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. And I don't really know how it happened. I always talk about, I don't know if anybody's seen the Ruth Bader Ginsburg movie On the Basis of Sex, which ironically is called On the Basis of Sex, so you would think that they would understand what that means. But there's a scene in the movie where Professor Ginsburg is typing up her sex discrimination brief, and her secretary comes to her and basically says, Professor Ginsburg, you're going to be arguing in front of a panel of men, and you use the word sex like 500 times in this brief. I think it's really distracting. Can we change it to gender? And she does. And I have no idea if that happened. It's probably apocryphal. It probably never happened. But I think it says a lot about why we in our society started defaulting to gender, because people are squeamish about the word sex. They think it always means intercourse, and it doesn't. So, they just say gender discrimination because they think it's weird to say sex discrimination. But it's not. Embrace the term sex when you're talking about discrimination, because that is what it is.
Oh, and there's one last, thank you, that was excellent. There's one last point which I think is important as well, is that there's a concept of a gender identity that is not a man or a woman, that is not male or female. So like, for example, in California's law, SB 132, you don't just have to identify as a woman/female to be in the women's prison. You can identify as non-binary, and the law says that non-binary is a set of gender identities, and then it lists some of the types of identities that count as non-binary. And funny enough, one of the identities, well, there's gender fluid, which means you can switch constantly, minute to minute, if you want. Then there's also, get this, one of the listed possible non-binary gender identities is agender, or without gender. So the law actually says that not gender is a gender.
Okay. Hang on. I'm sure.
I'm not making this up, people.
Kara, I know you have spoken extensively on this, and I want to make sure that you get a chance to add a couple 10 cents in here, please.
Thank you so much. A few things I would say. Like Jennifer, I don't know if what is described in that movie about Justice Ginsburg is true. I have heard it from numerous sources, so I would not be at all surprised if it is. I want everyone to know that this is international. So the use of the word gender has crept into international law at an absolutely astonishing speed and rate. And so this is going on globally, and it's absolutely terrifying, but I just wanted everyone to know that. I completely agree with Jennifer. Please do not use gender when you mean sex. I also completely agree with Devin's characterization of second wave feminism and how it conceived of gender as socially constructed roles And we at WDI refer to it as sex stereotypes. That's really all it is. It's the idea that girls have to like pink and boys have to like blue. It's all that stuff that we've kind of been dealing with all of our lives. And the only other thing that I will say is that this movement, and I'm talking now much broader than sports, but including in sports, has been incredibly successful in confusing the heck out of everyone by suggesting that there's some meaningful category of people for whom sex is irrelevant. And to follow up on something Devin touched on, I do my best to make the case in my book, as Kim said, The Abolition of Sex, How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls. I do my best to make the case in the book that there's this academic movement called postmodernism that Devin touched on. And out of that evolved this idea called queer theory. There's a lot to say about it, but at its core, queer theory is the idea that sex is not a material reality. And I really think that if these academics, mostly at Berkeley, had tried to sell ordinary Americans on the idea that sex is not a material reality, they would have failed colossally, because all Americans across the political spectrum know how babies are made. And so they did something that was ingenious, which is they invented the word transgender. And they persuaded Americans, again, across the political spectrum. I think Republicans are guilty of this too. They have persuaded Americans across the political spectrum, and I should say I'm not a Republican, never have been, that transgender is a meaningful category of people for whom sex is irrelevant, and it's not. It's just a lie. Thanks.
So I have a question before I get on to the next question I was supposed to ask. If we, as you're saying, Jennifer, stop using the word gender and just use sex, there's a lot of laws that use gender to give women rights. And so that makes me nervous. Should I be or not?
At the federal level, Title IX prohibits sex discrimination. Title VII prohibits sex discrimination in employment. Most of the federal laws are based on sex. They do not use the word gender. And that is why the Biden regulations that dropped last week are so radical and revolutionary, because what they say is that sex and gender identity all mean the same thing. Yeah. That has never been the case in federal law. Federal courts haven't, even though federal courts might slip into saying, in this case of gender discrimination, right? There are Supreme Court cases, big Title IX cases, where the justices go back and forth and use sex and gender interchangeably as synonyms. But they have never substantively held that those statutes prohibit discrimination on the basis of identity. They have never held that until Bostock. So the law as written does not include those words right now.
Is that, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I would just say, but Bostock has confused things tremendously, unfortunately. And so, in my work, I'm reviewing daily legislative language and the uses of the term sex or gender, or what is gender identity. And the progression of what we're seeing now in federal legislation is pretty alarming, because it used to be a little more aware, there's more awareness that, they were trying to enter in this concept of gender identity. Now they're just using the term gender and having it separated from sex. So they're saying sex and gender, or sex, gender. So, the confusion of what's going on in creating laws right now is alarming. And it's
Can you guys say anything to make us feel better?
I'm just saying, here. We're up there trying to fight the fight every single day.
Thank you.
And I can say that an organization like ours, we actually produce a scorecard on members, and what we do is certain legislative bills that are voted on, we are making decisions about what I say scoring against legislation that is using this kind of convoluted, confused language to hold members of Congress accountable to what they're writing and what they're trying to act on. And so, but it's amazing that that's the kind of
It takes
thing.
education because
It does.
because sometimes it's deliberate.
Yes.
Right. Sex, gender identity. Right. Some people are drafting laws deliberately using the word gender in order to achieve certain objectives. Other people are using the word gender
To be nice.
just because they think it means sex discrimination. I
right.
mean, we got something from Senator Tom Cotton the other day, a draft of something he was gonna send up to the administration, where he kept talking about gender, and I told his aide, change the word.
Yeah, yeah.
But
So-
it's not
yeah.
because he is intentionally trying to promote gender ideology.
I really want you, okay, so I need to ask the next question on here, but I really want to circle back, and if anyone just remembers to ask this question, I want to know in conversations with politicians, and Kara, I'm particularly interested in your conversations with Democrats, how informed the politicians are that are working on policy. So let's please circle back. I want to know if they're educated, because this is hecka confusing.
I'll just tell you right now, little by little, they're getting better. But when I started this, 5 years ago, and Kara and I were locking arms on this issue when she was at Women's Liberation Front, we were fighting something at the time, and we still are, called the Equality Act. The Equality Act was wanting to redefine in federal law on every title of civil rights law, adding the term sexual orientation and gender identity as a meaning for sex. Okay, we understand now the devastation that could bring, could bring into our culture in terms of the confusion and what we're really meaning.
The Equality Act is what President Biden is still trying to pass,
they're championing,
right?
and I can tell you it's championed by every Democrat who is, every member of Congress with a D by their names in Congress right now.
But do they know the implications?
I think they know the implications, and I think they support the implications. This is where we are. We're not a partisan organization. IWF's not a partisan organization. Wolf and WI aren't partisan organizations. Unfortunately, on Capitol Hill and with the officials that we're working with, it's a partisan issue. So on that, because of the Equality Act, we were reading into the danger behind that. We've been trying to educate members on the reality of what that means. And as you just mentioned, Devin, that it's all based on perception, like somebody's self-declaration. So as a woman, I can't go in and say, I'm uncomfortable, what my rights now are being overruled by somebody's super protection of having their claim to themselves be reality. That's the biggest danger that's out there. And there is a clone called Fairness for All, which some have looked at as a compromise, but it does the exact same thing. It gives women no standing in culture to say we have to have protections based on our sex any longer. So for those of you, and there are Republicans who've supported that, which is a problem and is something now going on in the states that we're having to fight for. So just to say that, to your question, where are they on their education gap, right? I mean, there still is a lot of gap here, but you have to understand that it's an activist movement behind this, that it's fueling where we are today. And many people on the Republican side of the aisle have literally tried to live in a cave and not have to deal with it. What happened with Leah Thomas is break the bubble, right? This burst the bubble of reality. For as long as we've been up there standing for female athletes for the last 4 years, filing federal civil rights complaints to CWA, and doing everything we possibly can, literally weekly, trying to educate members of Congress and seeing this happen. Finally, they're getting it. So we're now getting a lot of legislative proposals that are trying to push back on it, and that's where we end up with Senator Cotton or whatever, is trying to make sure that their language is right, so we're not going to codify or even propose in federal law something that doesn't have definition behind it any longer.
That's helpful. Okay,
Can I-
since we just heard a bunch from you, I'm actually going to ask, I was going to ask my next question to you, but I'm going to ask Kara to take it. Kara, can you tell us how this coalition formed? Because I think that's a really interesting story, and I know because you all don't see eye to eye on so many issues, I would love to hear how this began, and then everyone else can weigh in a bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I will just say on the topic Doreen was just discussing, I have spoken with Democrats who voted for the Equality Act in 2021, not knowing what they were doing. I have heard Democrats tell me, House
That's actually
Democrats.
comforting.
They don't read
Sorry?
the legislation.
That's comforting.
A lot of people think, and I don't even mean elected officials, I just mean people seem to think that this whole category of gender identity is some kind of like extra gay, right? And so a lot of Democrats voted for the Equality Act thinking that they were doing something to protect lesbians and gay people. And they really didn't understand that enshrining the words gender identity in the law as part of the definition of sex, they don't understand the implications of that. And by the way, one of the implications of that, as Doreen was alluding to, is that it would impact US public accommodations law all across this country. So I've got in DC, where I live, a local ordinance that says that businesses are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of gender identity. What that means is a person who goes by the name of Charlotte Clymer, born Charles, is allowed to access any women's bathroom in any restaurant in Washington, D.C., and does so, and eventually sued a restaurant for discriminating and won. I have walked into women's rooms in restaurants in Washington, D.C., and encountered men in them, and there's nothing the restaurant can do because the man can sue on the basis of his so-called female gender identity. And if the Equality Act were to pass, that would be the case throughout restaurants, hotels, sports arenas, airports, everything all across the country. And I have spoken with Democrats who voted for that, not understanding that at all. That is how successful this movement has been at confusing everyone. Though I think Doreen is right.
I think that confusion we see on both the right and the left. And Kara, I was with you in a meeting on the Hill where I heard you very pointedly ask a Senate staffer not to use the term SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity issues, because, and the right does that all the time. And this was a meeting with a conservative Republican Senate office. And you know, the left does it because they deliberately, but the right does it because they see some of those issues as linked. But the reality is, you know, gay and lesbian has nothing to do with gender identity, nothing. And so when
you have some folks in the crowd that really appreciate that.
Yeah, and so when you conflate them, though, it causes all sorts of legal confusion. And just cultural confusion. And so, you know, Kara's been a great advocate of trying to explain why we have to stop using that term, too, because it's not all one thing.
And it's, in some cases...
Yeah, although I do want to just quickly agree with Doreen that notwithstanding what I said about some of the Democrats who voted yes on the Equality Act in 2021, I absolutely think that the Democrats in the top places of power know exactly what they're doing. I have no doubt that the Biden administration, Speaker Pelosi, they know exactly what this is about.
So how did you become friends with...
So, yeah.
I want to know the coalition
Kara, how did we become
story.
friends? Well, let me just give a hat tip to Kara, how we become friends, because really it was because Wolf was looking for an outlet for actually getting this message out. The only place that would take them is the Heritage Foundation. And when they went on, had a panel one day, with the, you know, to talk about the dangers of the Equality Act, what was happening. We were seeing it in women's, in the Violence Against Women Act, domestic shelters, and so forth. And Kara was among some panelists, and I was at that forum and went up afterward to talk with her, and we just said we should talk. We had a mutual friend then also who linked us together, and Kara was willing to come and have a meeting. I just will never forget the first time that we came together, and really what we understood about our organizations, and I'll speak for me, and then she can say this. You know, sexual exploitation is one of our key core issues that we deal with and that we're fighting against, among with other ones dealing with religious freedom and life and so forth, and education. But this was huge, and turns out that we actually do agree on a whole lot of issues, because so many things that are about exploitation of women and children are things that are the core and identity of our organizations. And but it was a leap of faith, really, I think, for both of us, and maybe it felt even more for Kara than for me, maybe for different reasons, or for us. But what we realized is that this was the moment that we had to be able to show that we can come together and work constructively, and it has been a very constructive partnership for all of these years now.
I love that women are setting the example of reaching across the aisle. I really do. I hope our men can learn.
Any other memories for that point?
I just want to add that we haven't brought up the First Amendment yet, but this is something of great agreement among us. So even if we do disagree on particular issues, we all agree on the fact that we should be able to express our disagreement on those issues. And Wolf has...
Yes,
thank you.
very important.
Yeah. And Wolf has submitted amicus briefs in First Amendment cases as well. Usually, I mean, the intersection between First Amendment and gender ideology is often within compelled speech cases, right? So there was a Professor Nicholas Merriweather who actually won a $400,000 settlement because he was threatened with being fired. Was he threatened or was he actually fired? I actually can't remember that. But in any case, he was threatened with, at least threatened with being fired. And he won, I mean, he got the settlement because it was a public school and it was compelled speech. And so there are some victories under the First Amendment in compelled speech cases that we have seen across the United States. And Wolf has submitted amicus briefs in some of those cases.
So just a point on the First Amendment, that's going to get much worse post-regulation drop. And actually,
Wait, you mean the Title IX regulation?
so cases of compelled speech, cases of...
and when you say worse, do you mean we will have more lawsuits, or do you mean the world's going to be
we will have
stifled
more schools cracking down on people expressing views about gender identity. And so when you express a view, a disfavored view on gender identity, whether it's about pronouns or women's sports or anything that the powers that be don't like, anything that a classmate or somebody in the community might find offensive, that is now going to be considered sexual harassment in violation of Title IX.
But wait, this isn't real yet, right?
Well, first of all, it's already happening. It's happening in school policies all over the country. Stanford has a misgendering policy. Other colleges have policies that say if you dead name somebody or if you express an opinion about transgender rights that's not popular, and somebody feels that you've created a hostile environment in the classroom by expressing those views, the person who expressed those views has committed sexual harassment, even if their intent was not to be abusive or mean-spirited, right? So even if somebody accidentally says something or just tries to calmly explain their political view.
So are
But
people fighting back on
yeah,
this?
but so let me just respond though to where you're going. And I agree with Jennifer, first of all. Even when we were dealing with this even 5 years ago, none of the cases we were bringing forward were hypothetical. None of them were hypothetical. We weren't just saying this could do this. This was already happening in our culture. Okay, it's already happening. The cases have been out there for years now. But now it has the force of law. Right, well, yes. So what's happening right now is, and this is a process, right? The administration has proposed regulations. They'll be published by July 7th in the Federal Register, which is the trigger point for the public, which is you and me and all of your friends and associates, to write public comments to the Federal Register to express your views, and I would suggest opposition to what they're proposing. Because what happens is through this process of regulations, it will put in place federal law. It will change federal law for the way that we're dealing with these gender identity issues in a way that hasn't been in law before under Title IX. So it is a real threat, and maybe your next panel, who have some Title IX experts here, can go a little more into this. But the important thing for you to be aware of is the proposals on the table. We know what the Biden administration wants to do. They've been saying it from the first day that he was inaugurated to be president of the United States. And now we're at the point now where public activism, public engagement is so crucial and necessary in order to stop and to require modification or rethinking of what their policy is. Now, one of the things they said with their proposal was that they were kicking the can on more specific regulations around sports and athletics. Okay, that might be true, but I can tell you that just on the read of the existing regulations, they intend, and they already would cover, by manner of their wording, any activities or educational programs and activities which automatically include athletics. So don't be fooled, and we should comment, and we should comment again, and would comment every time you have a chance. But so to your point, yes and no. I mean, yes, it's a real threat. The administration's already put out guidance to schools that have said this is what we mean because the Bostock case says that we can and we should. And so we're already in this policy world, but then it could become much more permanent.
I would argue that the regulations, even when they become permanent, are themselves lawless, right? And that'll be an
Are they
argument.
executive order? Is that correct?
Well, first there was an executive order that basically instructed federal agencies to create rules about this. And now the Department of Education has issued proposed rules which are set to become law in the fall. They're set to become permanent. I think they're lawless. We will all submit comments. We will challenge them in court. We will do all of those things. But it doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter. Ultimately, it will matter. But the state of play on the ground is that the Department of Education is telling schools, and has been telling schools for over a year, you need to punish people who use biological pronouns. You need to punish people who dissent on issues of gender ideology, because that is creating a hostile educational environment for members of the LGBTQ community. That is the message they have been sending schools, and schools have been acting on it. There was a case it was reported in the New York Post, a case out of Wisconsin, where some middle school boys called a student she or her when the student wants to be called them, and there was a Title IX sexual harassment investigation. So this is the message they're getting from federal officials at the Department of Education, and this is what they're doing already.
So
Kim, can I jump in?
Yeah,
when
please,
there's a
Kara.
break?
Go ahead. Thank you.
I wanted to say something about speech and the Merriweather case that Devin mentioned, and also related to coalition building, which is one of your questions, Kim. Doreen mentioned that groups, nonpartisan groups that are basically on the political left, get a lot of criticism for working with conservative groups. And I just want to say a couple things. There are speech cases on the books where the American Civil Liberties Union does not hesitate to partner with the Alliance Defending Freedom when it comes to matters of free speech. They agree with each other on matters of free speech, and they're not afraid to say so. The American Civil Liberties Union did not have anything to say about Professor Merriweather's free speech rights in the case that Devin mentioned. So the ACLU champions free speech up to a certain extent. It does not protect the free speech rights of anyone, men, but especially women, to criticize so-called gender identity ideology. And I also just wanted to say, related to the heritage panel that Doreen mentioned, that was in early 2019. As she said, I was a member of the panel that was called The Inequality of the Equality Act, Concerns from the Left. It was my appearance on that panel that eventually made it so that my employment was untenable. At the time, I was working at a city agency, and my employer wanted to fire me for statements that I had made at the Heritage Foundation during my non-work hours, but they realized they couldn't do it because the First Amendment was going to get in their way, so they didn't. But over the course of the next year, our opponents were so relentless at harassing my boss, and she ended up spending so much time dealing with the situation that I ended up just quitting my job. It was just easier to do that than to stay at my job and make statements about sex and gender during non-work hours. And then very quickly, around the same time as the Heritage panel that Doreen mentioned, there was an event at a public library that Wolf had sponsored. Some UK feminists had come to Washington, D.C. to do some advocacy, and we did. And during that public library event, a journalist at the National Review asked the question, if the left can't solve this, can the right solve this? And there were a series of answers to that question, but one of my absolute favorite answers to the question came from the current Wolf board chair, Lear Keith, who said, it won't be the left, it won't be the right, it will be women working together. And that statement kind of changed. Yeah, it really changed my thinking on this whole thing.
Another point to be mentioned is that it's very annoying to be compelled to use a pronoun when you believe that it's incorrect, but it's more than an inconvenience. So, for example, at my university, City University of New York, there's a policy that says that it counts as sexual misconduct if you misgender someone during a sexual misconduct hearing. So there's an element of trauma for victims of, for example, sexual assault when they're being compelled. They're not just being, inconvenienced, they're actually being traumatized by being compelled to refer to their rapist as she.
Oh, gosh. Can you shed some good, like how are we gonna?
So okay, let me give you good news. Let me just start by saying this because I wanted to say this from the beginning.
I want to know that, like, what is our path forward?
Yes.
If someone runs into something like this, they have grounds to sue on free. How are we going to take this forward so that we can tell our government?
Well, I'm gonna let the
First
legal
Amendment
panel, because I think the legal panel is coming next to get maybe a little more granular into what you're saying.
I think we're going to focus on sports there.
Well,
so I
that's
do want to
okay.
hear from you
okay.
all.
Well, that's but it's all pretty much the same.
Yes,
I mean,
it
in
is.
some ways, and there's all related things here. There's a tremendous amount of increased awareness now over the last, let's say, 6 months, maybe since Leah Thomas. Let's say we have broken through a bubble here that is bringing a level of accountability that had out into the light. We talked about, Russ talked about this yesterday, that heretofore, all of this has been done like under the radar. And so the way that people could get bullied, harassed, sued or whatever is because there was no accountability in the system beyond activism that was going pretty much in one direction and supported by media outlets and others. Now, some of that's still happening. But what I can tell you is there's a lot more awareness among elected officials, among states. We have 18 states that passed Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Acts. That was not an accident.
Yeah.
Okay, there was one, that's right. And actually, we've got a couple ladies from Pennsylvania here working on the ground that worked with CWA and working with Wolf and WDI. What happened was in the first case in Idaho that passed, of course, immediately challenged, still in court, frankly. But that was from there was 8 states in 2021 and then 8 more and still counting in 2022. That's huge. That is state lawmakers being able to get across the finish line and in most cases signed by the governor, in some cases overridden a veto, to actually put something on the books that recognizes reality about competition in sports and that women deserve to have their own categories. So what I want to say is that in that, that is paving the way. We as an organization understood that sports was going to be the thing that people got and could engage in. And that's why it needs to be like icons forming, like we've been, this is what's needed to happen, was athletes to be given courage, for people to stand up and start saying it. We were doing it. We were trying to get as much information around and educating from our vantage point. But until it really became this real, we didn't get the attention. Just last week, when we had the 50th anniversary of Title IX, members of Congress brought together athletes. Some of you were there on these panels that happened. We had the rally. We had people standing up and trying to bring up the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act in Congress. Right now, frankly, we're outnumbered, right? I mean, and I say we, those of us on this side of the aisle are outnumbered because those who are in the ruling party, both from the White House and Congress, are not going to champion this issue at all. In fact, they're going to do everything to try to stop our progress. And so elections have consequences. This November matters. Next, 2024 matters. The way that we're going to start to fight back in the courts, the court of public opinion on sports is with us, right? And you know that, and the other side's paying attention. That's why they punted on these specific rules for sports. But as we have more and more awareness of the cost and the harm that's the harassment and the one-sided viewpoint on these issues, we're going to have more accountability in our system to help to give the Merriweathers, and having these cases that going through courts with judges that actually want to look at the law for what it is, which, as Jennifer said, it's not even, they don't have any legal standing in some of the Title IX things they want to do because Congress hasn't acted to give it to them. So we're going to have a progress, I think, on this, but we're going to have to be boots on the ground, and we're going to have victories and we're going to have defeats in the process.
We need people to speak out and to bring the lawsuits because if people don't bring the lawsuits challenging this stuff, it'll just keep happening. The only thing to stop schools from punishing people for saying things or allowing men on women's sports teams is if people sue. And there's a culture of fear, unfortunately, but hopefully things like this will change that. I think it's so audacious of the Biden administration to put these regulations out after the Merriweather decision, because here's a court of appeals. The United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit has said that misgendering policies at state schools violate the First Amendment, and yet the administration comes out and says, oh, no, they don't. If you misgender somebody, it violates Title IX. Like, they don't even care. So because they don't care and they're going to enforce their view of the law anyway, we need people to sue so that ultimately another court tells them no, or it goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yeah, you can't do this.
All right, I want to get on to relating sports to something you're working on, but I want to stop and just ask Kara real quick. I am encouraged, Kara. One time I spoke with you recently, we have seen in state governments some politicians becoming aware and crossing the aisle. There have been a couple of Democrats voting for these issues, protecting women and girls in sports. That encourages me that we are moving this issue, a little bit more to the conversation table. Have you had a few more conversations, Kara, that you just want to share so that we don't all feel like we're intimidated to talk to anyone that we feel might represent us politically or, with local concerns?
A couple of things. It is true there was one woman Democrat who voted for the Save Women's Sports Bill in Pennsylvania. There were a handful of Democrats who voted for the Save Women's Sports Bill in South Carolina. There were quite a few who voted for it in Louisiana. So definitely all hope is not lost. I will also just add that as people learn more about my book and they understand sort of where I'm coming from politically as a lifelong Democrat and a feminist who brings a leftist critique of gender identity, people don't hesitate to reach out to me on social media. And I hear from rank and file Democrats every day, either on social media or through email that I get through my website. People will say, I am a lifelong Democrat and I am so sick of this. I am a lifelong Democrat and I want to protect women's sports. I'm a lifelong Democrat and I care about Title IX. I work to pass Title IX and I'm appalled at what's going on here. So this really doesn't have to be a partisan issue, although as Doreen says, it is. But part of the issue, part of what's going on here is that part of why most of America can't hear from feminists is because it is not in the mainstream media's interests to platform us, because it helps their narrative to spin this as a narrative about a marginalized community on one side and the big bad Christian right on the other side. And the reason they do that is because that serves our opponents' ability to push that narrative and push their ability to succeed. Whereas if most media outlets would platform feminists like Devin or myself, biologists such as Colin Wright, who I know addressed this group, gay rights activists who are taking a strong stand about this, then I think we would be much more successful than we are. But the mainstream media so far has really done a terrible job because it doesn't serve their purposes.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Devin, I want to talk to you. We're going to ask. As we have seen governing bodies of sport at different levels wrestling with their rules and policies, we're seeing a lot of variation, and we heard a little bit about that yesterday, just that different sports are taking different positions and different age caps, different regulations on whether it's just identify in, like rowing on a given day, or whether it's the IOC saying, oh, we're moving from a year to let the governing sports figure it out, to FINA's new policy, largely protecting sex-based competition. And I had a really interesting conversation with Devin the other day about this, because we were talking about the third category options and why those have not been appealing to people, right? And she said there's a huge, those dramatically different positions parallel the more hidden issue in society of males in women's prison. And those policies from state to state really reflect what we're seeing in the governing bodies of sport, like sport. And I thought she would do a nice job of sharing why those arguments are so similar and why the creation of third spaces has not been embraced.
Sure. Yeah, there are a number of parallels between the women's prisons issue and the sports issues, the same types of debates going on. The third space category is basically unpopular because it doesn't affirm the identity of the man who wants to be a woman. It's rather simple, actually. The ACLU explicitly rejected in our lawsuit the idea of a third space for male convicts who identify as non-male. So they rejected it, right? And this is an important thing to emphasize, is that they want, this is a very absolute demand, they want access to women's spaces. They're not interested in accommodation, and that is what is so frightening to me as well. But I mean, it's just sort of goes hand in hand with the fact that we see this favoring of men's feelings over women's feelings, and there's always a focus on what the men want, and even a focus on the risks or alleged risks to the men, without any kind of interest in the feelings of women or the risks to women. And we see in the prison system, I mean, the situation is that the ACLU will say things like, well, you know, these men, these trans-identifying males, are at risk of like sexual assault in the men's prison, so therefore we should put them in the women's prison. And it doesn't come up as an issue that the women would be at risk of sexual assault. It's just simply, I mean, if that's not patriarchy, I don't know what is. It's just an arbitrary preference of men's desires. And you see this in sports as well. Why are the feelings of Leah Thomas's teammates in the locker room less relevant than Leah Thomas's feelings? Why does it not count as a hostile environment to be forced to undress in front of a male in a locker room? And this isn't one woman. This isn't a he versus she, his wants, her wants. This is his as one person's wants versus all of her wants, every single woman. One man doesn't count more than one woman. One man counts more than all women in this movement.
Amen. Amen. I would just also mention that rowing, I think, shows the challenge here. These draft rowing rules. Because they have the men's category, the women's category, and the youth, you know, boys and girls, self-identification. And then they're thinking of a third category, but it's for non-binary. Okay, it's like, okay, we'll throw everybody else in that doesn't want, you know, mixed category sports, but they're calling for non-binary. Whereas now we're going to have to accommodate, not just, again, we're not going to suggest that we should put trans-identifying athletes in this third category. We're just going to, because they should be in the category with which they, however they want to identify, but now we're going to create a third category for non-binary.
But non-binary still goes in the women's prisons. Yeah.
Well, yeah, right. In the case of prisons, right, they're going to still go in the women's prison, right.
What surprised me most as I learned about this was, you know, I feel like sports has been a real avenue, a path forward for a lot of women in life, right? It's reduced poverty levels, it's helped health, wellness, you know, crime statistics, violence against women. And it's provided a lot of opportunity for women to reach new levels of economic success, as it has for men. Sports have created avenues for, you know, people coming from disadvantaged backgrounds into new avenues of economic success. And I've always thought of sports as a wonderful equalizer in that way, a kind of an opportunity and a path forward. And learning that there are members of our nation, in particular, that are extremely vulnerable, that we would want to normally be promoting and giving these great opportunities too. We're taking those vulnerable members of society, and they're suffering from the same consequences that we female athletes are dealing with in a much more hidden way. And I thought when I was speaking with Devin, hearing about the parallels in those arguments, it just brought to life to me, brought to reality to me, you know, how women really need to stand together on so many issues. I mean, I love my female athlete friends here. I'm all about women's sports, but I do think, women as a collective voice and sharing their stories, as we heard from Lily the other day, it's important for us to find our power in sharing our stories and making each other more visible. So,
Not being afraid to be called not a nice woman, right? I mean, I've been called a bitch and I don't care.
I want to open it up for questions before we wrap up this panel. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists? Oh, I see one. Can I have someone run the microphone around? Oh, here comes one.
All right, thank you so much. I have so many comments and questions, so I'm going to have to limit what I ask. And first of all, this was so important, and you're all so impressive, and thank you for your work. And I'm just going to quickly make one comment. So at Harvard, there is a group of gender scholars who have formed something called the Gender Sci Lab, led by Sarah Richardson. And they are promoting the use of the term sex/gender. And just from the scientific point of view, so this was introduced by a scientist, something like a scientist, Sari Van Anders. And this is the concept that you cannot separate biological sex from gender, because the lived experience of gender role influences one's sexed biology. And that is true, but that doesn't mean that sex is not a distinct category. So this is infiltrating the science, which of course informs what you guys are dealing with legally, because this stuff is being published in the top, as Colin said yesterday, scientific journals. So we have no other scientific resource to fall back on, and we also have institutions like Harvard, as Devin can attest to, just completely caving into this ideology and failing to support scientists like me who are trying to speak and publish the truth and the facts, and it is now not possible to do without legal and social and professional sanctions. So that's
one of the reasons we put together the competition report, was because we were worried about exactly that science was being compromised,
Yeah.
that studies that were already out there were being buried, they were disappearing from the internet, and that new groups were forming to do scientifically flawed studies. So we wanted to collect everything in one place and at least have the citations, because by the time it gets to the courts, they may not be able to find the legitimate scientific
Well, there aren't,
studies.
because researchers are not able to do the science or publish, to do it even in the first place.
Say that again?
They're not able to actually.
Yeah, they're not even able to conduct the research now.
And
Right,
I'll also
right.
add that,
Or teach the kinds of classes that I was teaching.
Right.
Right. I'll also add that regarding the cancel culture, I was disinvited from Harvard, but my talk had nothing to do with gender or feminism. I am an activist in these issues, but my scholarly interests were actually entirely distinct from them. I was literally going to talk about 19th century British Romantic poetry and its relationship to ancient Greek and Indian philosophy. Okay, and they disinvited me because of this.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so that was just one comment. And the second question concerns why this is happening.
Stop telling these stories. I don't want anyone to be afraid. I do want people to realize, you'll hear from Martina Navratilova later today, and there are two things that she said, and I'm going to say them now because we're having a very intimidating conversation here. And the two things she said that were super inspiring to me are, we are in charge of our own destiny, and that's one of the reasons why she defected from the Czech Republic.
Right.
She wanted to control her own destiny. Right. She wasn't about to come to the U.S. and have someone else tell her what she could. And then, now I've lost my train of thought. Secondly, we've got your backs.
Right, right.
And I think that was the most important thing she said. We have to communicate to the girls that are coming up and the girls that are yet to be born, we have your backs.
Yep.
And I want you guys to hold on to that. In face of all this intimidation, the women that came before us, Donna De Verona fighting for Title IX, Nancy Hogshead-Maker going to battle to, support victims. We women have got to have each other's backs.
And that's why every bit of the landscape, all of the different places that we intersect in this issue is so important. So we've got, we're trying to have your backs in federal government, capital of what's going on there. The legal teams, the sports worlds, it all matters.
And Carol, you too. So
Yep.
now tell us your
Yep.
question.
What's your question?
So the second question concerns why, say, for instance, the Biden administration is taking these, making these leaps in, say, defining gender identity the way that they are and allowing male people into women's spaces. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on whether you think there's a role for big pharma or what you think the sort of large unseen forces might be that are at work here, because it does sort of beg an explanation. Yeah.
Kara, I'll let you do big pharma if you want to do big pharma.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, pharma benefits tremendously from putting a generation's worth of children on lifelong drug regimens, right? There's a man who's named John Stryker. He founded something called the Arcus Foundation. He's a multi-billionaire. He literally hands out money to push these policies. And we know that the Biden administration and the Obama administration before him were both heavily funded by a family called the Pritzkers. The Pritzkers generally control the governor's mansion in Illinois today. And another Pritzker once served under, I believe it was Secretary of Commerce under President Obama. And there's a person who goes by the name Jennifer Pritzker, a former military official. And these people have an astonishing amount of money, and they're paying the administration to do this.
And they're funding the places like at Harvard, and they're doing all of that. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, there is always a follow the money component here to what's happening. And unfortunately, the victims are children, are athletes, are women. They don't care. I mean, they have an ideology and an activism behind what they want to do and accomplish, and they have a lot of money to further that agenda.
Is there
I
evidence?
also believe
Sorry.
that the bureaucrats and the members of the Biden administration, they believe it.
Yeah, they're true believers.
They're true
right?
believers.
Yeah.
They're true gender ideologues. I mean, I'm not denying that you could follow the money and that money has influence, but they're true believers.
So is there evidence that there is big money behind this? Because if so, that really needs to come
Kara,
out.
there was that article recently, Kara, that you might remember that we corresponded about that was written, but I can't remember. Was it in Post Millennial? Where was that? Atlantic?
Well, I will say there's an article from 2018 in the Federalist by a woman named Jennifer Bilek, Bilek, and the title of the article is something like, "Who are the wealthy white men benefiting from this?" And that article is one of the first that she wrote in 2018. And she has now gone on to uncover some of the most astonishing facts about what is fueling this movement to abolish sex. And she writes about all of it at her blog, which is called the 11th Hour Blog.
That's right.
She's documented just about everything. And once you start looking, you can't not see it.
Right.
All right, we are going to wrap this. Am I on? Yeah. We're going to wrap this panel up. Is there one or two more questions? Yep. Go ahead, Sue.
This is a very simplistic question, and I'm trying not to be afraid, but I'm also thinking, gosh, I'm 60 years old. I try to keep up with pronouns and don't want to get myself into any heap of trouble, but if someone prefers to be called she or her, if you say they, do you get into trouble? Because then you're kind of, wow. And I will follow that up with, I wrote a letter to the NCAA and Mark Emmert, and I had a very difficult time wanting to be as understanding of Leah's situation as I could. I found it very hard to use the pronoun her, so I kept inserting Leah, and not even referring to that, because I just...
Let me just say...
I was going to say it's hard to anticipate what you'll get in trouble for, because what you'll get in trouble for saying today, or you won't get in trouble for saying today, you will get in trouble for saying tomorrow. So I think the answer is you have to not care.
Yeah, and the other thing is I am, yes, exactly. But I am careful in writing and just referring to, refer to Leah Thomas as Thomas, right? Or you find another way to write your sentence. Like if you're doing it in written form, it's a little easier. Doing it, off the cuff or verbal, catching things, it just takes practice. I do, right. But I do think it becomes, it's just hard, and we all slip up or one way or the other or whatever, and if it's one way, then you're immediately get pounced upon. But the other terms in terms of terminology, and Kara mentioned this, is when I'm also very careful not to ever say transgender woman. The reason is because anytime you put a feminine idea in somebody's head, they immediately think that you're talking about a woman or a girl. Okay, that's why we say biological male or males identifying as women. Okay, and I know that we freely use those terms, the transgender woman yesterday in some conversation, and that's okay in this group right here, but you have to understand that the clarity of language matters so much in our culture. It matters when you're talking in conversations with your friends. It matters in polling and having accurate polling on this, because people have to understand we're talking about male-bodied individuals. Okay, and so we don't use the terminology of transgender at all if we can get away with it. But we understand the media use that and it gets searched accordingly. But there's just the care in which we present our ideas and our information is really important.
And there are also pronouns that are not he, not she, and not they. So I don't know if some of you have seen them, but some of them I don't even know how to pronounce them, like with an X, Y, E, or whatever. I encountered a list of approximately 50 of them when I was forced to go to a gender orientation training as part of my graduate school education. So just FYI.
I was having, at the onset of learning about Leah, I was having conversations with, contemporaries and then even grandparents, and it was very difficult to get through the language, because when I said, well, she shouldn't be competing against the women, they were like, why? It was he, and of course not. So the language is actually critical in order to make a point, and I've spoken especially early on when I was trying to figure out how to discuss this issue, trying to be very considerate, as you are, Sue. And what I realized, I'm trying to be considerate to someone who's not extending me the same consideration. And that's a hard position to be in. So I think everyone in our whole country, in the world, needs to be willing to extend people respect, especially as it's earned and given. And I've said it multiple times, everyone has a right to present themselves in any way that they are most comfortable, and we should be kind and respectful to all individuals. But there does have to be a two-way street. So if you're finding your rights infringed upon, as many of us are here, to not be allowed to use the language that makes that visible and apparent and communicatable, that's unacceptable. So I think there does have to be a line that we're willing to say, I appreciate you as a human being, and I extend you all the rights and respect I would any other human being, but I have to be able to use the language that describes and communicates the discrimination or the disrespect I'm on the receiving end of.
Yeah, can I say a quick thing? There's an article on our website, fairplayforwomen.com, called Pronouns Are Rohypnol. We didn't
Are what?
write it. Pronouns are Rohypnol. Rohypnol, the date rape drug. So we didn't write it, but it was written by a Mumsnetter. You might know that back in Turf Island, Mumsnet has been, the source of all evil as far as the genderists are concerned. So I would encourage you, go on our website and just put in the search function, Rohypnol, and you will find that article. It's about what we've been talking about, the cognitive load that is imposed on you by constantly having to switch pronouns and get your words right. First of all, is just inhibiting. And then secondly, how it confuses everyone and everyone loses track of what on earth is being discussed.
I just want to quickly add on to the pronoun thing. So it was easier for me to just avoid pronouns, avoid the names entirely. So I'll refer to them as these athletes, biological males. So I just avoid that entirely because so not even give the other side a little, inkling of anything to use as ammunition against me. So that's kind of what I found. At least what works the best for me when I'm talking about this
We're going to
issue.
thank you very much, Lena. We have one comment from Devin, and then I do think we need to take our 10-minute break and get ready for our legal panel, which I'm very excited about. Devin.
Oh, all I was going to say is that the pronouns matter even more if you're reading an article and it's talking about, say, a sexual assault, like a crime. That matters even more. You see why that's a real problem. Like, she raped her. Like, what?
Yes, not our crimes. All right, let's take a 10-minute break, stretch your legs, and then let's hear about the brave souls who are tackling this in the courts. Thank you so much.